The American frontier, a land where legends were born and secrets were buried. Welcome to Uncovered Images. I'm about to show you photographs that have been concealed from history books for over a century. These images tell a story that powerful men didn't want told. A story of betrayal, bloodshed, and a conspiracy that rewrote the history of the Wild West. Before we begin, I should warn you, what you're about to see might change everything you thought you knew about America's most notorious outlaws. The year was 1879. The West was still wild, and the line between lawman and outlaw was often blurred beyond recognition. Photography was still a relatively new technology, and most people would only have their photograph taken once or twice in their lifetime. But there was one man who understood the true power of photography, a man named Thomas Wilcox. Wilcox wasn't famous like Matthew Brady, who documented the Civil War, but he had a unique obsession. He traveled the frontier with his bulky camera equipment, seeking out the most dangerous men of his time. He wanted to create a visual record of America's outlaws, not the staged portraits taken in studios, but the raw, unfiltered reality of frontier justice and lawlessness. What we're about to examine are the photographs that survived after Wilcox's mysterious disappearance in 1883. His collection was discovered in a sealed trunk in the basement of an abandoned bank in Tumbleweed Canyon, Arizona in 1967. The trunk contained over 200 glass plate negatives and several journals. But shortly after their discovery, most of the collection vanished, reportedly seized by government agents. Only 27 photographs and a handful of journal pages survived, smuggled out by a bank clerk who recognized their historical significance. For decades, these images remained in private collections, passed between history enthusiasts who feared what might happen if they became public knowledge. Now, for the first time, we can examine them together and piece together the story they tell. The first photograph in our collection shows 5 men standing in front of a saloon in a small town called Redemption Creek. According to Wilcox's journal, this image was captured on June 18, 1879. The men are clearly members of the infamous Jackson gang, led by the notorious Silas Jackson, a man wanted for train robberies across 3 territories. What makes this photograph particularly interesting is the man standing to the far right. Take a close look at his face. This is Harold Wilkins, who at the time was the deputy marshal of Redemption Creek. His presence alongside known outlaws raised no eyebrows at the time because no one had seen this photograph. This is our first clue that something wasn't right in Redemption Creek. The next photograph shows the aftermath of what appears to be a bank robbery. Bodies lie on the wooden boardwalk outside the First National Bank of Redemption Creek. The date on Wilcox's journal entry is August 3, 1879. The official report of this incident, published in newspapers across the territory, blamed the Jackson gang for the robbery that left 7 people dead, including 2 children who were caught in the crossfire. But look closely at this image. In the reflection of the bank window, you can see the photographer, Wilcox himself, but also another figure, watching from across the street. Wilcox described him in his journal as the man with the silver pocket watch. He appears in several other photographs, always observing, never intervening. The third photograph takes us to the hills outside Redemption Creek. It shows what appears to be a meeting between Silas Jackson and 3 well-dressed men beside a black carriage. Wilcox had to take this photograph from a considerable distance, hiding behind rocks to avoid detection. His journal entry reads, "The Eastern men have arrived. Money exchanged hands. Whatever they're planning, it's bigger than anything Jackson has attempted before." These Eastern men are key to our mystery. Based on other journal entries, Wilcox believed they represented powerful railroad and banking interests from New York and Chicago. The frontier wasn't just being tamed by brave lawmen, it was being shaped by wealthy businessmen who had their own vision for the West, a vision that sometimes required violence and lawlessness to clear the path for progress. The fourth photograph shows a massive explosion at Redemption Creek's silver mine. According to historical records, this disaster killed 46 miners and was attributed to careless handling of dynamite. But Wilcox's journal suggests something far more sinister. He wrote, "It wasn't an accident. The mine's owner, Harrison Potter, refused to sell to the railroad men. Now the land will go to auction, and guess who will be there to buy it?" The next series of photographs documents the arrival of U.S. Marshals and Army troops in Redemption Creek. They came ostensibly to hunt down the Jackson gang following the bank robbery. But notice how Deputy Marshal Wilkins seems to be guiding their search efforts. According to Wilcox's observations, the manhunt consistently missed the gang's actual location by mere hours. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing photograph in the collection. It shows Silas Jackson himself, sitting in the office of Judge William Montgomery, the territory's most respected judicial figure. They appear to be sharing a drink and a cigar. The date on this entry is September 10, 1879, during the height of the manhunt for Jackson. How did Wilcox get this photograph? His journal suggests he had begun hiding his small portable camera beneath his coat, becoming increasingly paranoid but determined to document what he was witnessing. Now, this next image requires context. It shows a man hanging from a tree on the outskirts of town. This was Marcus Wade, a journalist from St. Louis who had come to Redemption Creek to investigate rumors of corruption. His death was ruled a suicide, but Wilcox's journal entry reads, "They want us to believe Wade took his own life, but I saw Jackson's men take him from his room at the hotel. No one asks questions anymore. This town is ruled by fear." By this point in his journal, Wilcox's handwriting had become erratic. He knew he was documenting something dangerous, and he believed he was being watched. He wrote, "I must find a way to get these photographs to the authorities in Washington. But who can I trust? The stagecoach drivers, the telegraph operators, they all answer to them now." The next photograph jumps to October 1879. It shows a busy street in Redemption Creek with a strange figure I want you to notice. In the background, partially hidden behind a water trough, is a woman in a dark dress. According to Wilcox, this is Charlotte Hayes, a school teacher who had recently arrived from Boston. Wilcox became convinced she wasn't who she claimed to be. His journal notes that she asked too many questions and seemed particularly interested in the relationship between local officials and the business community. This suspicion is confirmed in our next photograph, which shows Charlotte meeting with a man Wilcox identified as a Pinkerton detective. The Pinkertons were sometimes hired by the federal government for sensitive investigations, but they also worked for powerful business interests. Which master was this Pinkerton serving? The photograph doesn't tell us, but it adds another layer to our mystery. The situation in Redemption Creek was reaching a boiling point. Our next photograph shows a town meeting in November 1879. Local business owners are confronting Judge Montgomery and Deputy Marshal Wilkins about the failure to capture the Jackson gang despite the continued presence of U.S. Marshals. Look at the expressions on their faces. The townspeople are angry, desperate for justice and protection. But the most revealing detail is in the background. Through the window you can see a man on horseback watching the meeting. Wilcox identified him as one of Jackson's men. The outlaws were monitoring the town's response to their reign of terror. By December 1879, Wilcox noted that telegraph communications with Redemption Creek were frequently disrupted and mail was being intercepted. The town was being systematically isolated. But why? What was coming? The answer appears in our next photograph, dated December 18, 1879. It shows surveyors working along the ridge overlooking Redemption Creek, mapping out what would eventually become the Transcontinental Railroad's southern route. The railroad was coming, and it needed to pass directly through where Redemption Creek stood. According to Wilcox's increasingly paranoid journal entries, he had figured out the scheme. The Eastern men need this land, but buying out every homesteader and business would be too expensive. Instead, they've employed Jackson to terrorize the town, making property values plummet. Those who won't sell will meet with accidents, like poor Harrison Potter. The next photograph shows a Christmas gathering at Judge Montgomery's mansion. Look closely at the attendees. Deputy Marshal Wilkins, the three Eastern businessmen from the earlier photograph, and most shocking of all, Silas Jackson himself, now clean-shaven and dressed like a gentleman. Wilcox wrote, "They no longer fear being seen together. They believe their plan is too far along to be stopped, but someone else was working to stop them." The next photograph, taken in January 1880, shows Charlotte Hayes, the school teacher, meeting with several townspeople in the back room of the general store. She's showing them something on paper, perhaps evidence. Wilcox didn't know what was happening, but he sensed a resistance forming. This is where our collection takes a dark turn. The next photograph shows Redemption Creek's schoolhouse engulfed in flames on January 20th, 1880. Charlotte Hayes reportedly died in this fire, along with 3 children who were taking additional lessons after hours. The official report called it a tragic accident, a knocked-over lantern. But Wilcox didn't believe it for a second. He wrote, "They killed her because she knew. The children weren't supposed to be there, just collateral damage in their grand plan." I can no longer stand by and watch. I must act, even if it costs me everything. The next two photographs are particularly haunting. They show Wilcox himself, having set up his camera with a timer mechanism. In the first, he's packing his photographs and journals into a metal case. In the second, he's burying this case behind the livery stable. His final journal entry accompanying these images reads, "If I don't return in 3 days, look for this case. Send the contents to Senator James Morrison in Washington. He's the only man with enough power and integrity to fight them." Then the photographs stop. Thomas Wilcox disappeared on February 2, 1880. No body was ever found. But our story doesn't end there. The final set of photographs in our collection weren't taken by Wilcox. They appear to have been taken by someone else who found his camera, possibly the person who eventually recovered the buried metal case. These final images show the aftermath of what newspapers called the Redemption Creek Massacre. On February 15, 1880, a group of men identified as the Jackson Gang rode into town and opened fire indiscriminately, killing 23 people, including Judge Montgomery and Deputy Marshal Wilkins. The gang was reportedly pursued by U.S. Marshals and killed in a shootout at their hideout. The official history records this as justice finally being served against the notorious Jackson Gang. But these final photographs tell a different story. They show the bodies of the so-called gang members at their hideout after the shootout. But look closely. These men don't match the appearances of Jackson's men from earlier photographs. And Silas Jackson himself is notably absent. Even more telling is the final photograph in our collection. It shows the railroad construction beginning at Redemption Creek in April 1880. Overseeing the construction is a well-dressed man with a silver pocket watch, the same mysterious figure who had been observing events throughout our photographic journey. Beside him stands a man whose face is partially obscured by a hat, but whose profile bears a striking resemblance to Silas Jackson. So what really happened in Redemption Creek? Based on these photographs and journal fragments, we can piece together a disturbing narrative. Powerful Eastern business interests, particularly the railroad, conspired with corrupt local officials to terrorize a town, driving down property values to facilitate a land grab. They employed the Jackson Gang to create chaos and fear. When some townspeople, led by an undercover Pinkerton agent posing as a schoolteacher, began to uncover the plot, the conspirators eliminated them. But what about the massacre and the subsequent deaths of the gang members? It appears that Jackson and his powerful allies staged the massacre, killed Montgomery and Wilkins, who had become liabilities, and then executed a group of unrelated men, possibly drifters or miners, dressing them as the gang to create the illusion that justice had been served and the threat eliminated. With the town decimated and the supposed outlaws dead, there was nothing to prevent the railroad from acquiring the land at rock-bottom prices and building their line through Redemption Creek. The true architects of this tragedy, Silas Jackson and his Eastern backers, simply disappeared into history, likely with new identities and immense wealth from their scheme. Thomas Wilcox, the photographer who tried to document this conspiracy, paid with his life for his efforts. But his work survived, hidden for nearly a century, until we can finally see the truth he sacrificed everything to expose. As we look at these images today, we have to wonder, how many other chapters of American history have been similarly rewritten by those with the power to shape the narrative? How many villains have been painted as heroes, and how many true heroes have been erased entirely? The story of Redemption Creek may be just one example of the hidden history of the American West, a history where the line between outlaw and lawman wasn't just blurred, it sometimes didn't exist at all. The real outlaws weren't always the men with bandanas over their faces robbing stagecoaches. Sometimes they were the men in expensive suits, manipulating events from the shadows, building empires on the blood of innocents. Before we end, there's one final mystery to consider. The bank where Wilcox's trunk was discovered in 1967 stood on the site of the original First National Bank of Redemption Creek. The town itself had been abandoned by the 1920s when the railroad changed its route. How did Wilcox's photographs end up in that basement when his journal clearly stated he buried them behind the livery stable? Someone must have found them and hidden them again. Someone who understood their importance but feared the consequences of making them public. Perhaps the same person who took those final photographs after Wilcox's disappearance. And why did government agents allegedly seize most of the collection in 1967? What was still so dangerous about these images nearly a century after they were taken? Perhaps some of the powerful families and corporations that shaped the West still had too much to lose if the true stories of their rise to prominence came to light. These photographs were hidden because they tell a story that contradicts the mythology of the American frontier, a mythology that powerful interests have worked hard to maintain. The Wild West wasn't simply a battle between law and disorder, civilization and savagery. It was also a battle for wealth and power, fought with bullets and bank drafts, wanted posters and land deeds. The outlaw photos you've seen today force us to reconsider what we think we know about that era. They remind us that history is written not just by the victors, but by the survivors, those who control what evidence remains and how it's interpreted. Thomas Wilcox didn't survive to tell his story, but his camera did, his images did. And now, after more than a century of silence, they speak to us about truths long buried in the dust of Redemption Creek. As we conclude this journey through these forbidden outlaw photographs, I encourage you to look more critically at the accepted narratives of history. What other stories might be hidden in attics and basements, in forgotten trunks and faded albums? What other voices have been silenced by time and power? The true outlaws of the Wild West may not be who we thought they were. And the true heroes, like a determined photographer with an old box camera and a sense of justice, might have been written out of history entirely. Thank you for joining me on Uncovered Images. If you found this exploration of hidden history valuable, please subscribe for more journeys into the photographic shadows of our past. Remember, every picture tells a story, but some stories have been waiting a very long time to be told. Our next episode will examine a collection of photographs from the Gold Rush era that suggests one of America's most famous mining tycoons built his fortune on a foundation of theft and murder. The images were discovered in a collapsed mine shaft in 1973, and they've never been seen by the public until now. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told. The truth is out there, preserved in silver and light, waiting to be uncovered. The day after Thomas Wilcox disappeared, a violent storm swept through Redemption Creek. Lightning struck the town's water tower, causing a flood that washed away part of the livery stable where he had buried his photographic evidence. Perhaps that explains how his metal case ended up beneath the bank, carried there by floodwaters and debris, buried anew by mud and time, waiting nearly a century to be discovered. Or perhaps someone found it, recognized its importance, and hid it somewhere they thought was safer. We'll likely never know. What we do know is that 2 months after the Redemption Creek massacre, the U.S. Congress approved substantial funding for the southern expansion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Among the primary beneficiaries was the Western Frontier Development Company, a corporation owned by the 3 Eastern businessmen who appear in Wilcox's photographs. By 1885, this company had acquired land rights across 4 territories, becoming one of the wealthiest corporations in America. Its founder, Theodore Blackwood, the man with the silver pocket watch, was appointed to a prestigious government position overseeing Western expansion and development. His descendants would go on to become governors, senators, and captains of industry, a dynasty built on the ashes of Redemption Creek. As for Silas Jackson, he vanished from history after February 1880. No more robberies were attributed to him or his gang. No wanted posters bore his face. It was as if he had never existed, or as if he had been reinvented as someone else entirely. Some of Wilcox's journal entries suggest he suspected Jackson wasn't even the man's real name. He wrote, "I've studied his features, compared them to the faces in Eastern newspapers. There's something familiar about him, something I can't quite place, but I'm certain he's not some frontier-born outlaw. His hands are too soft, his speech too refined when he doesn't think anyone important is listening. Could Silas Jackson have been an agent of the Eastern business interests all along? A well-educated man sent west to play the role of an outlaw, creating the perfect crisis that his employers could exploit. It would explain his apparent comfort in Judge Montgomery's mansion and his eventual disappearance once the scheme had succeeded. One final detail from our photographic collection deserves mention. In the last image, showing the railroad construction beginning at Redemption Creek, a small figure can be seen in the background, observing from a distance. The quality of the photograph makes positive identification impossible, but something about the posture and clothing suggests it might be a woman. Could Charlotte Hayes have survived the schoolhouse fire after all? Some historians who have studied these photographs believe she did. They suggest that Charlotte, likely a Pinkerton detective working for rival business interests or the federal government, faked her death when her investigation was compromised. The children reported dead in the fire may have been fictional, names added to the town registry, but not corresponding to actual residents. If this theory is correct, Charlotte may have been the one who recovered Wilcox's photographs and continued documenting events after his disappearance. She may have been building a case against Blackwood and his associates, a case that was never filed because the evidence disappeared into that bank vault for nearly a century. By the time the photographs resurfaced in 1967, Theodore Blackwood had been dead for decades, immortalized in history books as a visionary businessman who helped build the modern American West. His great-grandson was serving as a senior official in the Department of the Interior when government agents allegedly seized most of Wilcox's collection. A coincidence? Perhaps. The photographs we've examined today survived because someone believed the truth was worth preserving, even if it couldn't be immediately revealed. Like time capsules buried for future generations, these images waited patiently in private collections, passed between those who understood their significance but feared the consequences of making them public. Now, they allow us to glimpse a different version of Western history, one where the traditional roles of hero and villain are complicated by greed, corruption, and the ruthless pursuit of progress at any cost. The story of Redemption Creek isn't found in history textbooks. The town itself has been largely forgotten, just another failed settlement in the vast expanse of the American frontier. But these photographs force us to consider how many other Redemption Creeks might have existed, their stories similarly suppressed or rewritten to serve powerful interests. As we close this examination of these forbidden outlaw photographs, I'm left with questions that perhaps can never be fully answered. What happened to Thomas Wilcox's body? Did Charlotte Hayes continue her investigation elsewhere? Did Silas Jackson truly escape justice, perhaps reinventing himself as a respectable citizen in some eastern city? And most importantly, how much of what we think we know about the taming of the West is actually true, and how much is carefully constructed mythology designed to obscure darker truths? These photographs can't answer all these questions, but they remind us that history is rarely as straightforward as we're taught to believe. Behind every simple narrative of heroes and villains, progress and civilization, there are complicated human stories. Stories of ambition and betrayal, courage and cowardice, justice and injustice. The outlaws of the Wild West weren't always who we thought they were. Sometimes they wore badges. Sometimes they carried briefcases instead of six-shooters. And sometimes the greatest acts of outlawry were committed not by bandits in remote hideouts, but by powerful men in boardrooms and government offices, rewriting history to serve their own ends. As you leave this video, I hope you'll carry with you a healthy skepticism about the stories we tell ourselves about our past. Look for the gaps in the narrative, the voices that have been silenced, the evidence that has been suppressed. Because sometimes the truth has been hiding in plain sight all along, preserved in silver and light, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it and share it with the world. This has been Uncovered Images. Until next time, remember that history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember, what we choose to forget, and what we're willing to question. The era of the Wild West may be long gone, but its secrets continue to emerge from the shadows, one forbidden photograph at a time.